I always believed my wedding day would be the start of my happily ever after. I had the white dress, the lilies in my bouquet, and the man of my dreams waiting at the altar. But as the sun began to rise the next morning, I wasn't a blushing bride. I was a woman staring at a wreckage I never saw coming. It turned out the most expensive thing about my wedding wasn't the venue. It was the truth my father had been hiding for 24 years. The silk of my gown felt heavy, cold against my skin, as I sat alone in the bridal suite of the Grand Pierre Hotel. Outside those mahogany doors, 300 guests were clinking champagne glasses, celebrating the union of Lily Rose and Julian Thorne. My father, Arthur Rose, had spared no expense. He'd built an empire in silk and steel, and I was his only daughter, his precious gem, as he'd told the press a dozen times. Julian was the perfect match, a rising star in the corporate world. It was a merger of hearts and bank accounts. At least, that's what I told myself as I touched the lace on my sleeve. But something felt off. All evening, my father's eyes hadn't met mine. When we danced, his hand was stiff on my waist. He didn't look like a proud father. He looked like a man who had just finished a business deal he hated. I needed air. I slipped out of the suite, avoiding the main ballroom, and headed toward the balcony overlooking the private gardens. I expected silence, but instead I heard voices, harsh, hushed tones that cut through the night air like a blade. "It's done, Arthur. The papers are signed. Why do you look like you're at a funeral?" That was Julian's voice. My heart skipped a beat. Why was my new husband talking to my father out here in the dark? "Because I'm tired of the act," my father snapped back. His voice was different, devoid of the warmth he used for the cameras. "I've spent 2 decades playing the doting parent. Do you have any idea how much effort it takes to look at a face that reminds you of every mistake you've ever made?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, the scent of the lilies in my hair suddenly making me feel sick. "She adores you," Julian said, though his voice lacked any real defense of me. "She adores a ghost," my father hissed. "I gave her the wedding. I gave her the name. I've fulfilled my end of the bargain with her mother's estate. From tonight, I don't ever have to pretend again." The world seemed to tilt. I felt the ground swaying beneath my silver heels. My father, the man who tucked me in, the man who walked me down the aisle 3 hours ago, was talking about me like I was a debt he had finally settled. "You're going to tell her?" Julian asked. There was a long silence. I heard the flick of a lighter. "I don't have to," my father replied coldly. "She'll figure it out when she sees the locks changed at the house tomorrow. I never loved her, Julian. I just tolerated the obligation." The sound of their footsteps moving away echoed in the silence. I stood there, wrapped in thousands of dollars of lace and silk, feeling completely naked. By morning, my life wasn't just changing, it was disappearing. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The distant thumping of the bass from the ballroom felt like a heartbeat that wasn't mine anymore. I looked down at my wedding ring, a flawless diamond that now looked like a piece of shattered glass. Julian was in on it. My husband, the man I had promised my life to just hours ago, was discussing my disposal with my father over a cigar. I didn't cry. That was the strange part. Instead, a cold, sharp clarity washed over me. I realized that the Grand Rose Empire wasn't a family. It was a stage, and I had been the only one who didn't know the script. I slipped back into the suite, moving like a ghost. I grabbed my phone and a small leather travel bag I'd packed for the honeymoon. We were supposed to fly to the Maldives at dawn. Now, the thought of being trapped on an island with Julian made my skin crawl. I needed to know what obligation my father was talking about. My mother had passed away when I was 5, or so I was told.
But the way he said, "her mother's estate," sounded like a contract, not a tragedy.
I changed out of the heavy gown, tearing a bit of the lace in my haste. I threw on a simple silk slip dress and a trench coat, pulling my hair into a messy knot. I looked in the mirror. Lily Rose was gone. This woman looking back at me had eyes that were finally open. I bypassed the elevators and took the service stairs. I knew the hotel staff wouldn't question a bride in a hurry, but I couldn't risk seeing a familiar face. As I reached the parking garage, I saw Julian's silver coupe. The keys were in my bag. He'd given them to me earlier so I could tuck our passports in the glove box. I started the engine, the roar echoing in the concrete cavern. I wasn't going to the airport. I was going to the one place my father had forbidden me from visiting since I was a child, the old summer house in Blackwood Creek. The drive was 2 hours of silence, save for the wind whistling through the cracked window. Every mile I drove away from the city felt like shedding a layer of a lie. I kept replaying his words in my head. I never loved her. When I arrived, the house was a silhouette of rot and ivy against the moonlight. My father claimed he kept it for sentimental reasons but never set foot here. I broke a small pane of glass in the back door, reached in, and turned the lock. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and damp wood. I headed straight for the study. If there was a bargain involving my mother, the paper trail started here. I spent the rest of the night tearing through locked drawers and dusty cabinets. Just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the shutters, I found it, a false bottom in a heavy mahogany trunk. Inside was a blue leather folder. I opened it, and my breath hitched.
It was a trust agreement dated 2 weeks before my mother's accident, but it wasn't signed by my father.
It was signed by a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne, the same last name as Julian. I turned the page and found a photograph. It was my mother looking radiant and pregnant, standing next to a man who looked exactly like an older version of Julian. But the shock wasn't the resemblance. It was the notes scrawled on the back in my mother's elegant handwriting. To my dearest Elias, our Lily will never know the shadow of the Rose family. This trust ensures she stays with the person who truly loves her. My father hadn't just tolerated me, he had stolen me. The paper felt like ice in my hands. I stared at the photo until my eyes burned. My mother wasn't a tragic victim of a car accident who left me to a grieving husband. She was a woman who had been trying to escape. And the man beside her, Elias Thorne, wasn't just some stranger. He was the real reason I was sitting in the dark, in a house full of secrets. If Elias was my father, then what was Julian? My stomach churned. I did the math, scanning the dates on the trust documents. Julian was older than me by 5 years. He wasn't my brother, but he was certainly Elias's son. My father, or rather, Arthur Rose, had married me off to my own biological father's son. It was a sick, twisted way to keep the money in a circle that I was never meant to lead. Suddenly, the headlights of a car swept across the dusty walls of the study. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scrambled to the window, staying low. A black SUV had stepped out. One was Arthur's head of security. The other was Julian. He didn't look like the charming groom who had kissed me under a canopy of white roses. He looked frustrated. His tie loosened, his jaw set in a hard line. "She has to be here," I heard Julian growl as they approached the front door. "She's not at the penthouse," and the GPS on the coupe led us straight to the gates of this dump. "Arthur wants this handled quietly, Mr. Thorne," the security guard replied. "If she's seen the files, the merger is void. The estate reverts to the Thorne Trust immediately." I realized then that I wasn't just an obligation. I was a golden ticket. As long as I was married to Julian and under Arthur's thumb, they controlled the Thorne fortune that my mother had tried so hard to protect from me. I looked around the room frantically. I couldn't go out the back, they'd see me. I grabbed the blue folder, shoved it under my trench coat, and spotted the narrow Certus lift, a dumbwaiter, used for moving luggage between floors. It was tiny, meant for suitcases, but I was small, fueled by pure adrenaline and the desperation to survive. I squeezed inside, pulling the shutter closed just as the study door kicked open. "Lily?" Julian's voice was hauntingly calm. "I know you're hurt. I know you heard things you weren't supposed to hear. But let's talk about this like adults." I held my breath, the wooden boards of the lift creaking under my weight. I could hear them tossing the room, drawers slamming, papers fluttering to the floor. "She's not here," the guard said, "but the trunk is open. She knows." "Find her," Julian snapped, his voice losing its composure. "If she gets to a lawyer with those papers before the banks open at 9, we're finished. Arthur will lose everything, and so will I." I waited until I heard their footsteps head toward the second floor before I lowered myself manually to the basement. I crawled out into the damp, coal-stained cellar and found the small coal chute that led to the side of the house.
I squeezed through, my skin scraping against the rough metal, and tumbled into the wet grass. I didn't run for the car. They were watching it. Instead, I ran toward the woods, following the sound of the creek. I knew these woods from the few summers I spent here as a child, before Arthur banned the place. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was fully up. I looked like a wreck, mud on my coat, scratches on my face, and my wedding ring gone, left somewhere in the dirt of the cellar. I flagged down a passing milk truck, my heart in my throat. The driver, an older man with a kind face, looked at me with concern. "You all right, lady? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," I whispered, clutching the blue folder to my chest. "Can you take me to the city? To the central station?" As the truck pulled away, I saw the black SUV screaming down the road in the opposite direction. They were looking for a bride. They didn't realize they were now hunting the woman who was about to burn their empire to the ground. The train station was a blur of morning commuters and the smell of burnt coffee. I kept my head down, the collar of my trench coat turned up to hide the scratches on my jaw. I didn't have my purse, but I had the emergency cash I'd tucked into the lining of my coat weeks ago. A habit I developed living under Arthur's controlling thumb, though I never thought I'd actually need it to escape a manhunt. I ducked into a small, cramped internet cafe near the station. My reflection in the darkened screen of a monitor was unrecognizable. My eyes were bloodshot, my skin pale, but there was a fire in my pupils that hadn't been there yesterday. I logged into a burner email account and started scanning the digital copies of the Thorne Trust I had just discovered. The truth was even filthier than I imagined. My mother, Rose Thorne, hadn't just died. She had filed for a restraining order against Arthur Rose 2 days before her accident. He wasn't my father. He was her business manager who had become obsessed with her wealth. When she tried to leave him for Elias, the real Elias Thorne, she disappeared. Arthur used his connections to forge a marriage certificate, claimed me as his own, and buried the Thorne name under layers of legal red tape. Julian wasn't just a groom. He was the son of a distant cousin of the real Elias, a hand-picked puppet Arthur used to ensure that when I turned 25, the age when the trust was set to unlock, the money would flow straight back into their joint accounts. I had exactly 3 hours before the Thorne Trust automatically vested into the joint account I shared with Julian. If I didn't stop it, millions of dollars intended for my mother's legacy would be gone forever. I reached out to the only person Arthur couldn't buy, Marcus Thorne. He was Elias's younger brother, an eccentric recluse who lived in a fortified estate 3 towns over. He had been vocal about his suspicions for decades, but Arthur had used his power to paint Marcus as a conspiracy theorist. I called him from a payphone. "Uncle Marcus, it's Lily Rose, or rather, Lily Thorne." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. "I've been waiting 20 years for this phone call." A gravelly voice replied. "Where are you?" "I'm at the station. They're hunting me, Marcus. Julian and Arthur, they know I have the file." "Get to the city library," Marcus commanded. "The north wing. There's a private reading room. I have a team already moving. We have to get to the probate court before the clock strikes noon." I hung up, but as I turned to leave the station, I saw them. Not the police, but Arthur's private security. They were checking the exits, showing a photo of me in my wedding dress to the guards. And standing right by the main terminal was Julian. He looked calm, scrolling through his phone, but he was blocking the only way out. I realized I couldn't run. I had to blend in. I walked into a nearby gift shop, bought a cheap baseball cap and a bulky hoodie, and swapped my trench coat for the sweatshirt in a bathroom stall. I smeared some dark eyeshadow under my eyes to look like a tired student. I walked right past Julian. My heart was thundering so loudly I thought he could hear it. I could smell his expensive cologne, the same scent I had once found comforting. Now, it smelled like a trap. He glanced my way, his eyes lingering on my shoes, the silver wedding heels I hadn't had a chance to change. I didn't stop. I kept walking, blending into a group of noisy teenagers. "Hey!" Julian's voice echoed through the terminal. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the bus bay, jumping onto a departing city shuttle just as the doors hissed shut. Through the glass, I saw Julian standing on the curb, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He knew. I arrived at the library with 30 minutes to spare. Marcus was there, a sharp-eyed man with a silver cane. He just took the blue folder and handed it to a woman in a sharp suit, his lead attorney. "We have enough for an emergency injunction," the lawyer said, checking her watch. "But we need Lily to sign the affidavit in front of a judge, now." We raced toward the courthouse, but as we pulled up to the curb, a black SUV slammed into the side of our car. The glass shattered, and the world went sideways. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and deployed airbags. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the shouting outside. I looked over at Marcus. He was slumped against the door, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, but he was clutching the blue folder like it was a shield. "Lily, go," he wheezed, shoving the folder into my lap. "The courthouse, 3rd floor, room 302. Don't look back." I kicked the door open, the metal groaning as it scraped against the asphalt. I didn't feel the glass cutting my palms or the ache in my ribs. I just ran. Across the street, the courthouse steps looked like a mountain. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of car doors. Arthur Rose stepped out of the black SUV, his face a mask of calm, calculated cruelty. He wasn't running. He didn't have to. He had the police, the money, and the power. Or so he thought. "Lily," he shouted, his voice booming across the plaza. "Stop this nonsense. You're confused. You've been through a trauma. Come home, and we can fix this." I didn't stop. I hit the revolving doors and sprinted past the metal detectors. The security guards started to move, but I didn't give them a chance to ask questions. I flew up the stairs, my lungs burning, the blue folder tucked under my arm. I burst into room 302. Judge Holloway was mid-sentence, looking up in shock as a bruised, disheveled woman in a torn hoodie interrupted his court. "My name is Lily Thorne," I screamed, my voice cracking but firm, "and I am here to stop a theft 20 years in the making." Arthur and Julian entered the room seconds later, followed by their fleet of lawyers. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice smooth and paternal. "My daughter has had a nervous breakdown. The wedding was too much for her. We're here to take her to a private clinic." "I am not his daughter," I said, stepping toward the judge's bench and slamming the blue folder down. "This is the Thorne Trust. This is my mother's restraining order against that man. And this is the proof that he murdered my past to steal my future." The room went silent. Judge Holloway looked from the papers to Arthur's suddenly pale face. He put on his glasses and began to read. Outside, the clock on the town square began to chime. 12 o'clock. Julian stepped forward, reaching for the papers. "The trust has already vested, Your Honor. The funds were transferred to our joint account 5 minutes ago. This is a civil matter now." He smiled at me, that same predatory, handsome smile. He thought he'd won. He thought the money was already in his grasp. "Check the timestamp on the injunction request, Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice cold as ice. My clerk received a digital filing from Marcus Thorne's office at 11:45 a.m. The funds were frozen before they ever hit your account. The color drained from Julian's face. Arthur grabbed his arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of his suit. For the first time in my life, I saw my father look small. "Arthur Rose," the judge continued, looking at the security guards in the back of the room. "There are allegations of fraud, kidnapping, and potentially much worse in these documents. Officers, please escort these men to the holding area." As they were led away in handcuffs, Arthur turned to look at me. There was no love in his eyes, no regret, just the cold realization that the precious gem he had tried to polish and sell had finally cut him. I walked out of the courthouse an hour later. The sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in 24 years, the name Lily felt like it actually belonged to me. I wasn't a rose, I wasn't a puppet, I was a thorn, and I was finally free. Where are you all watching this story from? Please let me know your city and the time in the comments. Should Lily have forgiven her father, or was justice the only way out? If you enjoyed this journey, hit that subscribe button for more LilyCalm stories.